It's the Misfits.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We are live again. We are doing another episode recording, and this time we have a returning guest, Jake Doberenz, who he didn't even remember he had been on with me at one point because it's been a while. But he's back. I was just on his show a few weeks ago. Well, I guess actually it's been about a month ago now, hasn't it?
Technically,
It's been a while. Yeah, so I was on his show a little bit ago, but the last time he was on, we were talking about education, and we were talking about schools, and we were talking about all sorts of stuff. Today, though, we're going a different direction. We are going to be talking about something that is pretty much the topic of his show, but it's also something that I have found, at least with a lot of my dealings with people online, that is, trying to think of the best way to say it, that for whatever reason has become very complicated, I guess is the best way to say it. Complex, because people for whatever reason are suddenly in disagreement about what things mean, what we're talking about, and who even has talked about it in scripture. And so we're going to hopefully be able to break all of that down today. And we are going to be talking about idolatry and idols and all the things that are wrapped up with that. So, Jake, I'm going to actually start with you while I fix something on the stream that just popped up. Give us a little bit of a definition, Ren, as far as what do we mean when we say idolatry?
oh man, the thing is, this is the classic theology Bible answer of it depends. There are a lot of different ways that we can kind of mean by idolatry, and I don't think we're going to be able to go throughout all the ins and outs. Just as an example of the different ways that things can be used, on my podcast, Smashing Idols, we had a guest, Andrew Noble, and Andrew's doing his PhD on how technology can be an idol. And he goes through like 8 different definitions of idolatry for the Old Testament. So it's like really complicated if you want to get into the weeds. But if we have to do kind of a simple definition, I would say it's something like replacing God with something else, or bringing something else alongside God and having it kind of act like God. So when I grew up, a lot of the times idolatry was talked about in terms of like, what did you skip church for? Like, if you went to that Sunday morning soccer game, you're making soccer an idol because you skipped church, kind of like that. That's obviously a part of it, but it's not just about, okay, what do you skip church for, or something like that, or what do you do instead of the Bible study? It has a dimension of that, but I think it's a lot more complex than that too, because there are other ways where we sneak idols right alongside our Christian faith. So you might be at church and have an idol. As Andrew mentioned when he was on my show, Smashing Idols, we talked about how the Bible can maybe be an idol. And so we'll get into the weeds here, but I just kind of wanted to preface everything with that as it's really complicated and multifaceted, but it has something to do with replacing or bringing something else that's kind of has a godlike status alongside your faith and your practice.
And that's the big thing, is that it's complicated, but we have a basic, we can break it down into basics. Part of what makes it complicated is that we have a lot of people that will claim idolatry is like the big thing. It's the biggest thing. It's the thing that everybody deals with, everything like that, which in many ways I would agree with. The problem is that their reasoning behind it is a little bit off. Because the reality is that, and this is something that, when I even brought this up to you, you're like, I never even recognized this necessarily. Jesus never actually talks about idolatry. Ever. He kind of addresses it when he talks about the Shema. He kind of addresses it within Revelation where he talks about idolatry being in some of the churches. But he never really actually talks about idols. He never talks about idol worship. He never talks about any of that stuff. Paul and John are the only two in the New Testament that do. Nobody else does. Paul addresses it very explicitly in Athens because there's a lot of actual physical idols. Peter kind of addresses it, but only in the fact that when he gives his sermon at Pentecost, he talks about the story of the Israelites. John just barely mentions it a little bit in 1 John. It's not actually talked about nearly as much as people want to think it is. And that's part of why it gets so confusing, is that's why we have all these different definitions, is that everybody's assuming that it's something that Jesus talked about and talked about a lot, but he didn't. Because there were much bigger things that Jesus was dealing with that addresses idolatry when we understand it from more of a Jewish perspective of what idolatry actually is. Most of the verses against idolatry and talking about idolatry are coming out of the law and the prophets. I went back and was listening to a couple of different rabbis teaching on idolatry, and the first thing that came out that was kind of funny was that the majority of the teachings were on how Christianity is idolatry. But that's a different discussion. Most of it, though, talked about this fact that idolatry really has to be looked at as it is spiritual adultery. That changes a big piece of how we talk about this, because now Jesus has talked about it, and we'll get into that in a little bit. The other way that they talk about it is much more along the lines that Jake was trying to give a watered down definition for, is that it's seeking to have empowerment or comfort coming from a source that is not Elohim, the creator. The fun part for me, which I had never thought about, is that this is also something that's going to come up later in the discussion a little bit, is that this is part of the reason why prophecy is such a big deal, because prophecy is the counter to idolatry. Prophecy is seeking empowerment from the creator only to address those that are seeking power from other things. And then when we go one more step, the other issue we run into is what he already talked about as well, is that even if we just wanted to go and pull out one word for idol and to try and define it, we can't, because there's multiple different words for idol within the Old Testament. They all refer to different things. That's why this becomes very difficult. That's why it becomes very chaotic. Now, Jake, you talk with people weekly about different things that are idols. So just help us understand a little bit about what we're talking about here again with what are some of the things that people have come on to talk about. So like, hey, this was an idol I had to get rid of. I can start with mine, which was we talked about the Bible. But give us some others.
Yeah, so kind of the basic way I see kind of modern idols and idolatry, a lot of times it's people who love God, love Jesus, on board with that, but maybe they're like, but I kind of need a little bit of extra, a little bit of this thing on the side here to help me out, kind of hedge your bets, just to kind of give me kind of some room for safety kind of thing. So the idols we've talked about have been, I already mentioned, like technology. Some people rely on technology as the end all be all of human salvation or whatever. And then we've talked about more abstract things like control and achievement, complacency, where we get really comfortable with these things. We've talked about how feelings can be an idol because, again, it's something we rely on to the detriment of a relationship with God. And people probably won't say this directly, but a lot of times what happens with idols is this idea of, well, I don't fully have faith that God is going to do what God says he's going to do. And so I got to bring something else in. And then another big one we talk about a lot that comes up in different ways is politics, and how we so often outsource to politics just the sense of like safety or order or whatever. Oh, well, that can save us, or this politician can save us. Across party lines, there's a lot of idolatry when it comes to things like politics, because again, it's like, well, I don't really trust in God apparently because I have to have, this guy in power or whatever, so he can do all these things that I want him to do or something like that. So those are some of the kind of things that we've discussed in the show.
The interesting thing, though, at least with the people that we deal with a lot, is that when you bring up those kind of topics, is that the pushback that we receive is that's because idolatry requires there to a representation of something that could be physical. And typically what last couple of years, not as much even recently, but the past few years, is that whenever we bring up, especially in the political realm, to instead replace the idea of it being what they want to be some kind of demon, and so they want to replace the idea of, well, an idol, you have now become a god that they just Googled here. Do you think there's, well, I'm going to start with the difference between the idea of worshiping another god and the idea of idolatry? We'll just start with that one. Is there actually a difference again? Because we look at the 10 Commandments, the first commandment is and then he says no idols. So
yeah, I mean, we have an overlap between that idea, of course. And I guess I'll start with kind of this thought experiment of I've always been curious, like, because it's not really a temptation for us, I think, to go worship another god. I'm not like, ooh, gotta worship Shiva today or whatever it is. Like, so putting myself in the mind of an Israelite, why in the world, why would they be tempted to worship another god? It seems crazy. God's parting seas and coming down as fire. Why is some other god or idol a temptation? And I think it comes back to that idea I alluded to earlier. At its core, what an idol is a extra safety net, a just in case. And one of the attractive things about an idol or another god in general is they're often specialists, and they make, honestly, some bigger, better promises than God in some cases. So, if I'm an ancient Israelite and I'm an ancient Israelite woman or something, and I can't conceive a child, well, there are some goddesses that I can pray to for fertility. Or, oh man, I'm a farmer and the crops aren't doing great. I can pray to Baal, the storm god, the rain god, so that he can get some rain on the situation. God's not a special, Yahweh God Elohim is not a specialist God, and so it's not as attractive to some people. So, kind of bringing it back to the kind of combo of gods versus idols. Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities here. An idol is certainly kind of like the shortcut to that god, and that becomes a whole other thing. That's a way where we definitely fall into idolatry today, because there are these shortcuts we get, and it's kind of this idea of very transactional. So the ancient Near East religion was extremely transactional, right? You sacrifice and you get X. You throw some grain at the altar, you get this. You sacrifice the cow, you get this. And yeah, obviously Israel has a sacrificial system, but it was really not as transactional, at least in terms of tangible material goods. So, of course, it's really attractive to have something tangible. And that's where we fall into pits today, because something like politics is an idol, because it is a tangible way we try to control the world around us. Because if so and so is our leader, they can do so and so to the people we don't like. That kind of thing. It becomes very tangible, where the Israelite sacrificial system was more like, hey, well, we're going to get rid of your sin and things like that. That, okay, you can't really see how that
Right.
works and what's going on. So I I don't know if that solves everything, but yeah, gods,
Well,
worshiping gods, maybe not an issue today, but we definitely see that idolatry in that way of which we try to kind of hedge our bets.
and that really is part of where we've got the pushback comes in, is that we like to think is what you had said, as far as that we don't have the draw to go worship another god by any means. We just have the idea of the shortcuts. But ultimately, I think we're back. This is the stuff that Joe and I have talked about a lot on Kingdom on the Road and on the different things, and especially within Is It Pagan? Our perception of what sin, the problem starts. Because we're back to, well, if I just don't do this, then it's okay. The reality is that sin, the reality, majority of scripture talking about sin is calling up to make and take note of all these other things of our own selves and our own pictures more than it is about anything else. And so I would never go after Baal, but most of the time I think it's because we now believe we can handle it ourselves. And a lot of the time, the actual God that we are seeking after, rather than some other deity with a different name. And that's where it becomes very easy for us to slip into idolatry. In order for us to actually be able to make that claim, we've got to have things like you were talking about, the shortcuts that give us comfort and we're looking for. And so I would agree, they aren't separate. You can't get one without the other, but we've got to look at them in different ways. Us going after our own desires rather than relying on God to give them to us. So let's take a step back for a second and talk about what that means. When I was on your show and we talked about the Bible as an idol, that gets received, good thing that God gave us, so it can't be used for bad. But what we talked about there was, again, it was where the heart posture is and how we're using it and what we're using it for. This is part of the reason why I wanted us to talk a little bit about how the rabbis talk about it, and especially with this idea of it being spiritual idolatry. Okay, it's very hard to say adultery in the same sentence without screwing it up. But Jesus has very specific teaching on adultery in Matthew 5. That, I think, is where we actually need to start with addressing what idolatry looks like within our own lives. It is with that. So I'm going to put you on the spot here, Jake. What is it that Jesus actually says about adultery in Matthew 5? See if you can remember.
Oh, fun. Well, I mean, you got the Sermon on the Mount. I specifically about adultery. I'm not sure exactly what you're getting at in Matthew 5. He says it's bad. Is that what you're talking about?
No, it goes beyond that, though. So in this section, you're correct. It's the Sermon on the Mount, but that was the easy points. What we've got after Jesus then goes in and talks about adultery and murder. Because in the Beatitudes, it was, murder of the poor, blessed, all these different things. Then you have heard it, right? This is where we get, it's no longer eye for eye, it's now just the evildoer, it's now love your enemies, not just love your neighbors. It also addresses, though, murder and adultery very specifically. Because within the Old Testament law, there are very specific circumstances for something to be considered adultery, for something to be considered murder. Jesus now, and with murder, it's if you have hatred in your heart, you've already committed murder. And with adultery, it's if you have already lusted in your heart, it is already adultery. It's about the posture and about the thought process and about the way that we are approaching things. Now, if we go into what the rabbi talked about as far as the fact that idolatry is spiritual adultery, now idolatry has been blown wide open, because it doesn't matter what the thing is. If we have gone after it for the same thing that we would expect God to do, we are now in idolatry. Doesn't matter what it is. Even if it's something that is good or something that God may have given us. If we are looking to that to be the saving grace or the source of empowerment or even the source of comfort, we have a big problem. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the Tower of Babel comes to mind as an interesting example. Kind of the maybe the first example in the text of idolatry or kind of going after things. We don't have a lot of details in this part, but it was definitely an example of, I think if we're going to treat them charitably, they maybe thought they were kind of doing a good thing. Oh, we're going to build this tower to heaven. It's going to connect us with God. That's why people built ziggurats and pyramids and towers and things. It was to connect with the divine. So, yeah, this will help us connect with God here. But it quickly became a project all about them. So it's an example of like, okay, it was a good intentions, maybe, but it ultimately their heart was not in the right place. It was focused on them. And also God had totally told them, you guys got us scattered. Like, you're not supposed to stay here anyway. So they weren't even listening to God, but they're trying to justify it because, oh, well, it's kind of godly, I guess. So that's
well, let's start there, actually, because I think you brought up a good point, and then I'll go back to what I was going to say in response to that initially. A lot of the time within the Old Testament, especially, the places where we see big moments happen is when people to be. David not on his roof. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones now. The guys that stole the treasure from the city when they during the conquest were not supposed to be there. They were supposed to have been off taking the city, not collecting treasure for themselves. All these different things where they were in the wrong place by their own choice. When we do that, I don't know why we expect anything else to come about. I mean, that's the bottom line with it at this point, is like, why do we think that us going the opposite direction is going to wind up in a good spot? Now, the other response to that is, I think there's one other story before we even get to Noah and before we get to the Tower of Babel that maybe even more so gives us an idea of how easily idolatry sneaks in, even when it's not, we don't actually have evil intention in our heart. Because this is part of the other problem we get into, especially with the politics discussions, is that when politics is the idol, everybody's assumption is that they are doing it for the benefit of other people and that it's for the greater good. And that honestly probably is actually true in how they are thinking about it. Doesn't change the reality of what it actually is, though. And this is where, and we may start getting, I don't know if we'll get comments on this round or not, but I get these comments all the time when I bring this up. Is that this is part of the reason why I think we read the story of the fall incorrectly. So in Genesis 3, well, here we go. You're not going to want to come back on Misfits because I'm now giving you the same treatment I give Joe and everybody and Brandon and Tamiko as I start doing quizzes on the spot. let's set up the scenario here in Genesis 3. In Genesis 1 and 2, God creates mankind. God puts them in the garden. God tells them what to do. Is there sin in the world at this point?
Trick question? I don't know.
Not really. That's not really a trick question, because this is part of what we've got within the narrative, right? God declares everything to be
right. Within the narrative, yes, there's no sin.
right. Within the narrative, we don't have sin, and especially at least within humankind, we don't have any kind of sin nature within the narrative, right? The serpent shows up and starts talking to Eve. And what is the temptation that he actually gives Eve? He says that she's not going to die, but instead will become what?
Become like God.
Become like God.
Yeah.
Now, when it's taught to us, we're told that this is about power, right? And that was the issue, is that she wanted to be like God and she wanted to overthrow God. And that was the big problem. But if they don't have any concept of good or evil yet, is that actually what she's going to be searching for? No, right? She had no reason to. They have everything they need. God's supplying everything. What is it that Satan tempts her with? You will be like God. What is it that Jesus tells us we are supposed to become more like? We're supposed to become more like him, God, right?
God through Jesus.
So
right?
This is not a bad desire. Wanting to become more like God is actually a good thing. It's something that we as believers are striving for. She has good intentions. She wants to be more like her creator, the one that walks with her and provides for her. She wants to be more like him. The problem came in the method that she does it. It was a shortcut. And in doing that, shame and sin enter the world. And now we have evil desire, because now we know what it's like to get what we want easily. We now know how to cheat the system. It sneaks into something that we initially have good desire for, but those good desires, when gone about in the wrong method and in the wrong way, instead of making us feel better, give us a desire for more and more power. And when we are desiring more and more power, we are continuing to push ourselves up the ladder and continuing trying to pull God down. And so this is part of the danger when we get into the idolatry talk, is that when we don't realize how easily it sneaks in, first of all, it becomes very easy to fall into it. But it also then again, now we're back to the complicated, well, is it actually idolatry, or is it trying to become God, or is it both, or what is so? We're going to try to actually nail some stuff down now. When we talk about idolatry, we'll do the typical Misfits thing. We're going to read the actual dictionary definition for a second, and then I want Jake to help us go past the dictionary into, with everything we've talked about so far, what an actual biblical idea of idolatry is, so that we're all on the same page before we start talking about what it looks like in today's world. The dictionary says it's extreme admiration, love, or reverence for something or someone. I think that's a good starting point, but I don't think it actually does get us to where we need to go, because this definition also then deals with things like idolizing somebody in a good way. You idolize your parents. You idolize, you idolize people that you want to become more like, which is the whole thing we were just talking about with Eve. So take us the next step past admiration, love, or reverence for something. What then gets us into the point where now we are at idolatry in terms of the sin that we are dealing with?
Yeah, I think kind of the key word is kind of a competitive element, because you can revere and respect somebody, but if that is competing with your love and practice of God and of faith, we have a problem. So that's where you got spiritual adultery. Is the idea like adultery? Just strictly speaking, is you're married to somebody and you're cheating on them. You have a side piece kind of thing. And so a spiritual adultery is you have a spiritual side piece. You have you're getting stuff from somebody, something else. And then in the New Testament, where we might not have that same kind of language of idolatry, we certainly have the language of adultery, but there's also a big emphasis on allegiance, where Jesus says, "Hey, you can't serve two masters, God and money. Like you got to choose here." And honestly, one of the best literal translation of the word we translate faith, which is this Greek word pistis, is probably something like allegiance or loyalty or something like that. And so we are supposed to have allegiance to God, and so we don't get to have allegiance with other things in the same way. So that's what I would add to that dictionary definition is something about, okay, well, this is competing with God. I can respect my parents and stuff, but if it becomes the point where, oh, my parents are infallible and everything they say is gospel truth, well, now we have a problem. Now it's competing with my love and respect of God.
And that's where the heart element comes back in, is that you're no longer, if you're competing with somebody that you respect, you're better yourself in a good way. That is, in some cases, that does produce good things. But at the same time, you're also trying to prove yourself better, normally out of a way of trying to get respect from them. And so now we're into a whole we have, and this is one where I guess we could add this on to the discussion about the Bible as idolatry, is that if you are using the Bible as a way to try to gain more respect from God because now you are more godly, that's a huge problem. That's a huge problem, because now it's also where we get into this idea of, well, if I have more faith, then that means God looks at me better than other people. And ultimately, this gets us to the final point, and so we'll just say it here in case it's going to be one of those too long didn't listen type of situations, is that ultimately part of where we arrive when we get into the idea of idolatry within Scripture is that we're back to the fact that it starts with loving God and loving other people. Because if you have an idol that's preventing you from loving God, obviously we have a big issue. Because that means that God is no longer even in the equation. So now there's no way to say commandment 1 and 2 aren't separated. But if it's preventing you from loving other people, we still have the same problem, because now it's about what I can control and who I can control and who I can overpower. And we know that is not from God. And so ultimately, that's where we end up back, is that when you are going to be looking at things as far as, is this an idol in my life? Those are the two benchmarks you've got to start with. Is this preventing me from loving other people? Is this preventing me from loving God? But I think we need to now transition, because this is where it's going to get a little bit spicy, I guess. Is you talked about the idea of idolatry having the aspect of allegiance. And now is where we are going to start getting into some of the political here as far as why this discussion needs to be happening. Things like the Pledge of Allegiance. Things like, taking oaths and things like that. I'll let you start, and then I'll give my 2 cents, and then we'll look at this from this is our 2 cents and this is what Scripture would say type of thing. Where does that fall? When we're talking about giving allegiance to, the country or, to, whatever it might be, where does that actually fall on the idolatry scale?
Yeah, I mean, some people would say, oh, it's just words, just say the Pledge of Allegiance. Doesn't really mean anything. And I mean, yeah, I guess it's not like contractually I'm not obligated to pledge. I don't know, whatever that means. But I don't say the Pledge of Allegiance. I haven't for years because I do actually think that words matter, and I think that words shape our hearts. And the things that we repeat a lot is liturgy, right? That shapes us. And so I don't say something like that, but that's not to say I don't have any respect for America. I just want to. Sounds terrible. I want to keep my options open. Like that is not my main. I don't. Okay, let me be clear. I don't want America to fall. But if it does, like, God is still God and faithful, and we're gonna be okay. Even though, I mean, it would be a miserable time, but we would be okay in a spiritual sense and all that kind of stuff. Um, but then there's other things like, I mean, I've had to sign contracts for jobs and take oaths and things. I volunteer for the state government as a court-appointed special advocate for foster kids, and so there's an oath I have to take in front of a judge for that kind of thing. And so I'm not against those sorts of kind of situational things where, like, I will take an oath to tell the truth, to do the duties to the best of my ability, that kind of stuff. Because, hey, I'm going to do that anyway as a Christian. But when it comes to allegiances, I want to keep my options open because there might come a time when I need to critique or leave or whatever. My existence is not tied to that nation or to a particular party. I've been a registered independent since I could vote. Like, keep my options open. So that's my kind of personal opinion and approach, where I don't want to make grand gestures of allegiances, but there are times where I might specifically, like, well, yeah, I'm going to say an oath or respect this or that and things like that. There's a difference between allegiance and, like, I promise to do a good job kind of thing, in my opinion. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I want to say that it would be hilarious to watch somebody chop this up because you have said adultery and keep my options open multiple times in the past 30 minutes. But, and this is where I fall, because same as you in many ways. I don't think I have actually said the Pledge of Allegiance in the past 10 years. Growing up, we were required to do it in school. We even were required to do it at some church functions, things like VBS and things like that. I have a major problem with it now. Now that I have understood more about both American history, understanding theology, understanding these kind of concepts we're talking about now, I've got a big problem with it. My kids still have, my daughter has to say it at school. She has to say it at school. I understand that. And that's what I think ultimately where we need to fall on this is that this is one of those things where it's a matter of conscience. Why are you saying it? Are you saying it because you're required to? Or are you saying it because you mean it? What are we doing here? And that's where, so make sure that we say this off the bat before we get into the other stuff. We're not saying if you say the Pledge of Allegiance, you have committed idolatry and you must now go and repent. But maybe ask yourself, why am I saying it? Because this may be something where it's a wake-up call type of thing. Because this is one of the questions, Pastor Andy and I were joking about starting a new trend on Threads of questions unanswered on social media. One of the big ones that goes unanswered for me is why so often we see pastors and Christians talking about having to defend Western civilization or classical thought, those kind of things. Like, why? And the only answer is, well, this is the American way type of thing. It's like, well, why is that supposed to be our defense? And so if you are one where that is the goal and the Pledge of Allegiance is a big deal to you, maybe we do need to step that one back a little bit. If saying the Pledge of Allegiance is just, hey, I want to support my country, and so we're back to it's how I am going to be able to love my neighbors, then I don't see an issue here. You know, this is part of what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians in multiple spots, but especially in 1 Corinthians 9. Everything is acceptable, but not everything is beneficial. And so, does it have benefit? Does it benefit the gospel? Does it benefit the kingdom? Then by all means carry on. Does it not benefit the kingdom? Does it cause downfall to the kingdom or to the witness or to other people? Then we need to step it back. If not remove it altogether, we at least need to step it back. Now, part of where we can also go to for these sort of things, and this is where whenever I've taught government classes in Christian settings, this is typically where we go, is before I even let the kids open the textbook, when I was teaching, government and civics in Christian environments, and you may appreciate this as a teacher yourself here, Jake, is that before we open the textbook, the first week or two was spent looking at Jeremiah, looking at Daniel, looking at Romans 12 through 14 as a whole. Because we need to actually understand where we sit in all these sort of things. And we're not going to get into that whole thing now. We might later at a different time. But specifically when we get into the idolatry part of this, looking at Daniel is one of the best options we've got. Because you have Daniel, who is an exile. He is basically a slave within Nebuchadnezzar's court, treated pretty well. But part of why he's treated well is because of this very thing that we're talking about. In Daniel chapter 1, well, we're back to testing you, Jake. What goes on in Daniel chapter 1? Do you know?
Yeah, Daniel's brought, and I guess his friends, but we don't see them necessarily have pop up yet, to Babylon, and he refuses to eat the meat. Is that what you're referring to?
Close. He doesn't actually refuse to eat the meat. And this is part of why it's important for us to talk about it. Because again, this helps us with understanding what's going on. Daniel and his friends don't want to eat the meat because it violates what they have actually pledged allegiance to, which is God and his law, right? But when they go to the king's man, they ask if there's any other options. And they say, if the king says no, we will eat it. Because they're assuming that if there is another option, that's what God wants. But if God's okay with this, then we'll know by our request being refused. That's why the whole test goes on. They say after 10 days, if we're not up to your standards, not our standards, if we are not up to your standards, then we will eat what you got. They don't actually refuse to eat it, but they aren't going to just immediately go into that until they have done the work to seek out what God has asked them to do. And then the next chapter in Daniel 2, we see Daniel going before the king after the king's about to execute all of them because he's cranky because he hasn't slept in days. Daniel addresses Nebuchadnezzar as, "O king," bowing before him. Now, in many cases, people would say, well, that's idolatry. He's bowing before a foreign king and declaring him king. And within a Babylon setting, there's a little bit of a deity level type of thing going on here. But yet Daniel chooses to do this. And God blesses him for it because that is part of what allows Nebuchadnezzar to listen. Daniel pledges himself to Nebuchadnezzar. He's going to serve Nebuchadnezzar, and we see this throughout the rest of the book because when we get to chapter 5, when Belteshazzar is in control and Daniel is no longer in his service. And when Belteshazzar sins against God by drinking from the bowls from the temple, when Daniel arrives, Daniel does not address him as king. Daniel does not bow down to him. Daniel does not even want his rewards. He will not bow down to him. He served Nebuchadnezzar and pledged his allegiance there, but he will not do it to Belteshazzar because God has not appointed him. But then when Darius and Cyrus march in, Daniel's ready to give his service back. because it was about what God had asked of Daniel to do, not about just the borders that they were within. And that's where it gets to be very, very complicated in today's timeline and setting, is that we aren't in a situation where we have kings that live a lifetime and then die, and then we have a new king, or we have a new empire. And we're the part keeps switching. But yet that's not how we approach it. So, I mean, that was a long way to get around with the Pledge of Allegiance type of thing, is that, again, we've got to recognize where we're actually putting our allegiance. We've got to recognize why we're doing it, and it's got to be a heart posture thing. Now, that the politics one is the more complicated one, because this is one that people want to claim they don't have, even though they do. The other one that gets denied most of the time, I put, is people say that you can't actually make an idol of yourself. I want you to start and see where you fall on that. How you would either correct that statement or defend that statement, as far as, can you actually make an idol of yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes, but with kind of the caveat that, like, when ancient Israelites say yes, I don't know, maybe not exactly, because this kind of relies a little bit more onto our more modern views of self and things like that. But absolutely, following our definitions, can you commit spiritual adultery with yourself? In a way, if it is distracting you from God, if you're elevating those things above God, then yeah, there's going to be a way in which that is going to become like an idol. And I think there's definitely a push, and it's not just a secret liberal agenda kind of thing. It's Western civilization as a whole, whatever side you fall on, that kind of says something along the lines of, be true to yourself, and know thyself, and things like that, and focus on that. And I mean, I, growing up, would always tell my mom, like, hey, I'm the foremost expert on myself. But as I got older, I realized, well, actually, I have a lot of blind spots. I mean, I know a good bit about myself, but yeah, other people can observe things that I just missed, and things like that, and the ways in which, yeah, I was making myself an idol. So I would say in our modern understanding, yes, we could. That is something you could focus on. And certainly the Old Testament and New Testament world would be aghast that we would be so focused on individualism too, and not on how we participate in our communities. So definitely they would think that's pretty bizarre.
Well, and that part of it is a different discussion, I think, that we would need another 3 or 4 hours to do, and then Joe would be mad at us that we didn't include him on it. But the bigger thing there, I think, I think you are 100% correct, and I think especially in the area of the psychological understanding of ourself is a little bit different now than it was at the time. But I think we miss what Paul actually talks about when he talks about idolatry throughout most of his letters, when we say that they didn't have this same kind of understanding. Because the majority of the time where Paul says, this is idolatry, is when he's listing off things that will keep you out of the kingdom of God. All of them have to do with ourselves. Things like gluttony is idolatry. Well, gluttony is, using food as your comfort. Well, you would think that food is the idol here. Food's not the idol. Because if food was the idol, then it wouldn't matter if you were getting it or not. In fact, you probably would be hoarding it rather than, stuffing yourself. The feeling of fullness is the idol here. That's a personal thing. Things like lying lips are an idol because you're trying to control the narrative. You're trying to control the truth. It's about control of the situation. It's about me having control. Sexual immorality is an idol because it's about control of my body, not yours. All these sort of things, Paul says, you know what? This is actually idolatry. That's the issue here. And it changes again. It forces us to have to look, and that's why I love the fact that you said really they would be appalled at the sense of self-worth and not focused on the community is a big part of it. This is again going back to what Joe and I have talked about multiple times throughout the other KFM series stuff, is that when you look at the Old Testament law, sins were things that caused harm to the community. It wasn't about causing harm to myself. It was about causing harm to the community. We don't think about sin that way. We think about it as, oh, I messed up, and so now I'm a failure. Well, that in itself, even the way we're talking about sin in many ways, is idolatrous because it's taking out everybody else and just focusing in on, woe is me, the sinner. That's not how this is supposed to be set up. And so even when we start talking about idolatry in these sort of ways, it's like, even the act of wanting myself to feel full can be an idolatrous stance. Because what am I doing is that I'm saying that my belly matters more than other people. We no longer are loving our neighbor. This is what Paul talks about in Philippians 3 as far as the idea of, their God is their stomach, their glory is their shame, and that they bring about destruction. It's the enemy of the cross are those things. All of those things are idolatrous, and it's about our own mindset and stance, needing ourselves to be at the top and everybody else to be thrown away. And that's where I think more than anything, we really get into why this keeps getting brought up in discussions that we are having online. I don't know about you, the ones that I'm having online at least, is that especially when we get into things like talking about nationalism, talking about America first, talking about even the immigration stuff, talking about, racial divisions, talking about financial divisions, all these different things. When we've got these divisions among the community, we can pretty much guarantee there's an idol somewhere. I mean, that's part of what idolatry causes, is it causes there to be a division somewhere. And it's not just a division between you and God. It's a division between you and other people, even if you think your relationship with God is good. So, and this is what Gio just dropped in, and I just now saw it, this part of what he said as well. When he became a citizen, he had to say an oath, but I'm a Christian first overall. That is part of what we were talking about originally. It's not a problem that you took an oath to become an American citizen, as long as that does not become the main thing. Because when that becomes the main thing, now we end up in the places that we are seeing people denying the image of Jesus on other people, denying the hurts and needs and wants of other people, denying all of these different things, because the call of a believer is to deny ourselves. Because if we deny ourselves, we then have to rely on Jesus to do what we need, which is part of where we get back to the original definition we gave, as far as that idolatry is about where you are going to as your source for comfort and empowerment. So anything you want to add there, Jake?
Yeah, I'm just reminded of something that really annoyed me that my mom would say when I was a kid, where it'd be something like, "Oh, you're addicted to TV. You watch TV too much," and she would say, "Well," and I would say, "Oh, I'm not addicted. I like it, but I'm not addicted to it," and she would say, "Okay, well then do without it. If you're not addicted, just cut it out for a week, something like that." And I'd be like, "Well, I mean, like I could do that. I just don't want to right now." And so sometimes, in order to measure what's become an idol or something, we have to whether or not we can cut it out, at least do the thought experiment. Could I live without that? If I wasn't an American citizen, how would that shape my reality about myself and things like that? If I wasn't in control of XYZ, how would that change? And if that's a nightmare scenario, I mean, like, yeah, that might not be good. I mean, I would rather be an American citizen as opposed to a citizen of certain other countries, for sure. But maybe that's a thought experiment we can engage on just to kind of test. Oh, has something else become an idol? Well, how would you do if you went without it?
Well, I think there's another aspect to the thought experiment that maybe needs to happen first. And it wouldn't even necessarily be a thought experiment. It would just be a way to help get the blinders off. Because you'd used the word blinders earlier.
Mm.
Are you even in a position where you know what it would look like without? You know, have you had the discussion with people that do not have the same thing you do? Do you actually know what life is like in other countries from the mouths of the people living there, not just what you've been told? Do you know what it's like to live in certain parts of this country where there's food scarcity, instead of just believing what you've been told that everybody is fat and happy within the US? You know, have you talked to the people in Flint, Michigan that went, almost a decade without clean water? You know, have you actually talked to somebody from Gaza? Have you actually talked to somebody in Ukraine? Have you talked to people within, the Eastern world? You know, before assuming that what you've been told is correct, my thought process on. Because again, it's about the community. Does your community allow you to even be able to start having these kind of discussions, start having these kind of thought processes? Because it may even be something where, and we get into this all the time with everything we do, but in some cases the idol may be something you have inherited. It may not even be something that you sought after. It may be something you inherited. Does your community allow you to even have these kind of discussions and thoughts? Because if they don't, then the idol is within the community. It may not even be your idol. It may be your community's idol. These sort of things are things where we have to start actually doing the work to getting ourselves into where we can actually have the thought process, be able to look at idolatry in these different ways. And that starts with the act of humility first and foremost. We've got to be humble enough to say, maybe I have an idol here. Rather than just jumping into defensive, well, this isn't an idol because it's could this be an idol? And if it's not, then why is it that they're saying it is? Is it because it's just something they disagree with? Or is it because this is something that maybe it's not an idol for me, but it is for other people, and so I just need to be more careful with it? What is the intent of the person telling me this? And then what is my intention as well? So with all of that, Jake, you deal with this stuff every week on Smashing Idols. So give us a little insight. What do you got coming up here soon? You just released an episode yesterday, which was on I don't remember now. I wrote the ad for it, now I don't remember.
Yeah.
What was it?
We talked about complacency.
Complacency, that's right.
Yeah, and this particular guest was left her Broadway career and became a mom, and then talked about transition to empty nesting and all that stuff. Let me find my list of upcoming episodes so I can tell you what's going on. Okay, yeah, we got some more conversations about politics. Yay. That's definitely what's in the zeitgeist. And we're going to have some things that are going to make people really mad. So it's going to be great. Also have an upcoming episode. I know, it's so fun. Upcoming episode that's talking about how belief can be an idol, which is really
that's a good one. Who's that with?
Kevin Sweeney.
Oh, nice.
Okay. In Hawaii. Yeah. And we got and then I got another episode coming up was Justin Belt about how church numbers and attendance can be an idol.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, and one of the themes of the whole show is basically, what if things were just a little more simpler? Because a lot of times with what becomes an idol is all the other stuff you stacked on and said, oh, this is now really important to the Christian faith. When it actually, sometimes we need to strip it back. And so, yeah, numbers are one of those things that have become an idol because we think, oh, that's the measurement of God's blessing. Turns out,
so if you want to find out more, you can scan the QR code, or there's a couple of ways you can actually find him. One of them is the QR code will actually take you to the KFM Broadcasting website, where you'll be able to find all the information for his show there. You have a website, don't you? I don't remember what it is. Is it jakedoberenz.com?
I do have jakedoberenz.com, but the podcast stuff is on jakedoberenz.substack.com. I host all that on my Substack.
Yeah. So all of that you can find there at the KFM website or at the two things he listed. You also can find, I think you can find all of that in his guest portal on the Misfits site as well, which we are still working on. For those that didn't know, Smashing Idols is one of the newer shows on the KFM network, along with a lot of the other good stuff, including Kingdom on the Road, which will be this Friday again at 10. Here on Twitch and on all the other channels as well as that. You can check out all of the KFM stuff going on by going to kfmbroadcasting.com, including definitely you should also go check out the prayer portal there if you're in need of prayer. kfmbroadcasting.com/prayer. You can then fill out a form that will come to the prayer team, including Jake and I, so that we can pray for you. You can give us as much or as little information as you want there. Again, you also should be able to find, I think, all that stuff, because I'm pretty sure I updated your stuff recently, on the Misfits website, ministrymisfits.com, and then go to the guest portals. We are hoping that the new website will be up shortly. We're not 100% sure how long it's going to take, because I keep on I didn't realize. So do you know how many guests you've had on, Jake?
Yeah, because I can see we've done what's been out is 32 episodes, and so it's about 30 guests because a couple of those are solo.
Yeah, that's I think we are at the last count I had, and this was with me taking one guest off that asked to be taken off our list just because they were just kind of like trying to disappear from the internet. I think we're up to 57. And when I'm trying to make the guest portals for each individual, it's taking a lot longer than I thought it would. So that's what's delaying us, is that we've got a lot of guests and we want to make sure we get all of their work out there and on the website as well. So it is coming. It'll be out as soon as we can. In the meantime, though, the new merch shop is up. So because of the fact that we are now on Twitch, we were given the opportunity to join in with Fourth Wall. They've now created a new merch store for us that will save us a little bit of money, Misfits wise. Go there. The QR code will take you there. I don't actually know the full length link because it's a little bit longer. But we've got a bunch of newer stuff, including some of the classic old Misfits style gear, but we also have some of the newer stuff for the Misfits Outdoors, which tomorrow, Thursday, assuming that the rain holds off, I will be back online to do the Misfits Outdoors stuff for a little bit in the morning. Be sure, though, to go follow. We have their own pages now on TikTok. You can find it there or on Instagram as well. So those of you that care more about the fishing and theology stuff, go there to make sure you stay updated on that, but you can still find it on all the other Misfits channels as well. So I may be back on for a little bit here in about, 15-20 minutes. We'll see. It depends on if I've got the stuff I need or not for some other work that I gotta do. I may be back on doing some Minecraft stuff here in a little bit, but if not, we'll probably talk to you tomorrow. Jake, you got anything else you want to plug before we head off?
No, man. Sounds great. Thanks for letting me chat with you today.
Oh, I do actually have something to plug for you that I don't think we've plugged for you yet. If you don't know, Jake is also a children's author. So Jake has a couple of books out already. I think. Are you working on another one already, or?
Yeah, third book is done. I just gotta get it edited and formatted and cover design, all that fun stuff.
Yeah, so it's Super Jake and depending on which book you're looking at. So give us a little rundown on what's going on with that for those that might be interested for their kids.
Sure. It's kind of a middle grade book, so 4th to 7th, 8th grade, roughly in that age range, that kind of those grade levels. And it's about a superhero who shoots ice cream out of his hands. And the first book is Super Jake and the Fashion Police, where he gets his powers. In the second book, his brother gets powers, and they just save the day. And it's not explicitly Christian, but the bad guys do represent elements of culture that tries to tell you to be a certain way. So minor spoilers, but in the Fashion Police, the bad guy wants everybody to dress a certain way. That's how you be cool. You have to dress this way. In the second book, the bad guy wants everybody to, he wants all men to be really masculine and muscular and work out 12 hours a day kind of thing. And so through humor, the books challenge some of those kind of cultural ideas of what it is to be a cool, interesting, good person. So yeah, that's on Amazon and all that fun stuff.
So yeah, even in his children's books, he's still talking about smashing idols. So
Yeah,
go check out all of Jake's stuff. Smashing Idols, the podcast. You can also check out all of his writings on his Substack. You can go to Amazon, find some of his children's books, as well as some of his other books he's written that are more adult theology style. And again, check out all the other KFM broadcasting stuff, kfmbroadcasting.com. And you can check out all the Misfits stuff at ministrymisfits.com. And we will see you next week or in a couple of minutes or tomorrow or Friday, depending on what you want to actually turn into. So we will see you then.
sweet.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/ministrymisfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/ministrymisfits.